I've never had that before. I don't know if you guys noticed it. Our timer stopped on 22 seconds. Normally,
mine kept going.
It didn't do that to mine.
Didn't it?
No.
Kept going.
That's weird. I don't know how that happened. But anyway, there you go. I was stuck on 22 seconds to go, and I'm thinking, well, this is a bit weird.
You're just channeling a bit of 90s garage, that's all.
Was, yeah. Needed a bit more of a beat to drop, though, I'm afraid, Alex. It was a little bit slow.
Right. That would have been a good podcast.
Maybe we should do that next time. Oh, that'd be amazing. Anyway, right. We are now live. Alex, so just for context, for you, Alex, and obviously anyone who is watching live or recording, I mean, we don't do it for that, but we do this for transparency purposes. I'm a big believer that our industry isn't as transparent as it could be in terms of its sort of knowledge sharing and insights. And, when Amy and I decided to write this book, we just said, well, actually, we're going to interview a load of people. And probably a paragraph or 2 paragraphs might make a book, but these interviews are going to be interesting because there's going to be so many insights from different people that we want to make sure that everyone has a voice, and we might as well share it. So we decided to do the live stuff. So thanks for having us in that sense. Alex, do you want to just? There are not many people when I read the sort of the biographies over time that you realise just how much stuff they've done, and I probably couldn't even repeat most of the things that you've been doing in your lifetime and what you do now, because there's so much of it. So can you just give people a little bit of précis in terms of where you are, what you're doing, and probably be interesting in your insights as to why you think I thought and Amy thought it was a good idea for you on here?
Well, I guess the first bit is, which industry you think we're talking about, because again, one of those things is that there's lots of silos and professional specialisms and they don't always map across each other that well, but we can get to that. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted. Yeah, I have the epitome of what's called a squiggly career. There's a brilliant book about that. So, I set out, I was going to join the Foreign Office and save the world and eat lots of Ferrero Rocher and kind of do public policy and languages. And obviously that didn't work out, but I ended up as is working in kind of in public policy and government, and sort of landed in this space around urban policy and economic development and cities and place, and kind of, it's not all geography and colouring, and it's actually quite interesting. I then worked in a kind of the third sector, so I worked for the largest non-profit called the Urban Land Institute, which is in the space of kind of that urban development investment realm, which is a fantastic education. It was like a real estate MBA on speed, because I was in the room with all the CEOs and of the biggest companies, along with the mayors of the biggest cities all around the world. I got to work in phenomenally interesting places like Boston and Berlin and Hamburg and Istanbul, and really get that crash course, but without coming in the traditional route and the traditional siloed path into property. So I spent quite a big chunk of my career with people going, what are you? Because I don't have that easy tick of being, I'm not an architect or an engineer in the design space. I'm not, I'm from Madrid, but I'm not, I didn't come in through the traditional fund management sort of trajectory of sort of finance and accounting and real estate analysis. So actually, for a long time, I was quite dismissive of it. And I said, it's just common sense in asking stupid questions. But actually, I ran my own business and did consulting for 6 years. And actually, what I've learned is actually being strategic. I think that way, not in a very linear way. And a lot of our industry, if you think of real estate or property or the built environment, whatever you call it, is incredibly linear. I actually think it's quite revealing about what people do call it, depending on where they sit. And, I think, we say real estate, which obviously is an American term, tends to imply money, but I think we use it in a UK, European context now to, the people who are doing the transactions, so the kind of the land and the portfolio side of things. Property is still very much really attached to the building, the developers, but there's an interesting world there where we are in this, and kind of where the tech bit of your world, James, sits, is that, when I started working in this space 20 years ago, people were like, it's about bricks and mortar. Well, a little bit, but actually a lot of it is about the space as a service concept that, that Anthony Slumber's got everyone talking about so long ago. But actually this idea that you're selling a customer experience, but also there's entire industries within the building, the tech that enables those buildings to have purpose, that is important. And people who talk about the built environment might be in the kind of policy design kind of space, but we're actually all doing the same thing. And to your point at the beginning, the lack of opacity in the wider sector is remarkable, because there's lots of very kind of formulaic paths. You could be a surveyor, a planner, an accountant, an investor, but actually we all interact with buildings. Hopefully we all have one to sleep in. Hopefully we all have, somewhere to work. We all go into a shop or a restaurant or a hotel or a shopping center. But so few people have any kind of realization of the entire ecosystem that goes on to make those buildings exist and operate and function. And it's a really interesting space to be in, but we don't sell it as that. And it's actually, therefore, often, and particularly in the UK, quite nepotistic, quite homogenous, quite siloed, because in the UK, and again, it's a quirk to the UK, but our feudal land system gave way to kind of property that is owned by relatively few numbers of people at any large scale in terms of land, and it was very inextricably linked to our lack of land in the UK. So we have all that stuff. Anyway, so there's all sorts of interesting things about where you can sit, but I sit across all of it. So I said I did bits and bobs in the public sector, I did lots of international advisory and consulting, and I set up my own business in part because I didn't fit in those silos. So when I realized I wanted to get closer to the action, and ULI was a non-profit kind of advisors, but you were never doing the deals. The challenge I then had was that people going, yeah, but you're not a surveyor, so you can't pass our HR tick. So you need to go back a few levels and maybe go on the grad scheme. And by that time, I was in my late 20s, and I was like, I've got a CEO network, I've done all of this stuff, and I'm not going to go and do another degree just for the hell of it. So I went out on my own, which is bold or stupid, but again was great because I just did interesting work with interesting people all over the world, and built up this, asking stupid questions and learning about the different ways that technology is starting to apply in a residential space, in a commercial space, all of those things that none of my peers who were traditionally trained had, because it's wasn't in their courses. So I accumulated this expertise in the kind of in between spaces, just by asking, and poking around and trying to research it. So I did that for a few years, and then one of my clients was kind of going, is Places for People, which is where I am now. So it's a phenomenally interesting organisation. It started as the North British Housing Association. It's one of the UK's largest providers of social housing, but actually now it sees itself much more as a social enterprise. One of the key things is that lots of housing associations are charities, but not all of them. PfP was never set up as a charity. It was set up with a kind of a more union structure, like it's called an industrial and provident society. So they reinvest all of their profits. Like a lot of housing associations, it had been approached by private equity through the kind of noughties and tens, when affordable housing became that kind of nice tick for people to have in their portfolio, and actually found that they could do a lot of work and do a partnership, but there's a quirk that means that regulated entities like housing associations that take grant from government, they can raise debt on their balance sheet but not equity. So essentially they're always going to be the junior partner in the kind of financial structuring, and that translates to you do all the hard work and the heavy lifting, but all the upside goes to your investor. And so PfP were really pioneers in saying, do you know what, we're going to set up our own. So where I work now, which is a business called Thriving Investments, it is the only wholly owned fund manager, wholly owned by a social enterprise. And so after we pay returns to all our investors, and their commercial returns, they're not suppressed, their market returns actually usually above market because we're pretty good. All of our profits go back into Places for People, and will support social housing, but also supported living with people with complex needs. So that could be disability, it could be homelessness, it could be kind of other issues. We have a range of domestic violence refuge services all across the UK that we support, and frankly the grant funding for that stuff has diminished to fumes over the past couple of decades. So I'm really proud to work somewhere that is entirely commercial, but that is genuinely able to do something about social value in its most holistic form. So that was exactly as you predicted, James, a big meander through stuff. But I think the point is that when you said like our industry, I was like, what do you mean by that? Because it really depends where you sit. And at any given day, I might be sitting in a room of planners, or a room of kind of pure finance investment people, or I might be sitting in a room of developers with a load of local authority construction kind of focus. And that's what I love about it. That variety is amazing. But I've got to that because I had this squiggle into it through a sector that is evolving and doesn't often know that it is.
I have so many questions.
Amy, do you know what I was thinking? Amy is loving this. I can just tell. But can I just say one thing, which is why I love listening to Alex in the various ways I've listened to her in the past. Because normally, Alex, if I'm listening to something, if I'm like listening to a podcast or in particular YouTube videos, I do what the kids do, and I put it out to like 150 speed. I never need to do that with you.
I could blame my ADHD, but it's also my grandmother. So
it's your grandmother's fault.
It's good for her. She got very cross that I gabbled, and she was quite cross. So she insisted that I went to elocution lessons, and all that I did, I was like, well, I'll still speak quickly, but I'll do it very clearly. So you've got no excuse not to understand me, but I will still go fast. So yes, sorry.
Everything that you're saying is fascinating. I absolutely love it. I'm really interested in you talking about your squiggly career, your non-traditional career. It's particularly interesting in quite a traditional industry. What what does that allow you to do differently? I can imagine you walk into lots of rooms and really creating aha moments for people, really helping them shift their way of thinking about things, their way of seeing the world. What do those shifts look like? And what do you bring? I can really see that you bring a change of pace, a change of focus, a change of perspective.
Thank you. I try, and I can try and be slightly dismissive, but part of the kind of manic hand waving and speed is that I'm very passionate about what I do. So I'm lucky that I care about it, and therefore I do enjoy it. So I try and transmit that energy and into, a lot of people who work on, if you're working on a big development scheme, it can take 10, 15 years. Planning in itself is a battle, multi-year battle for, a single house, let alone for kind of a range of them. And we're dealing, in quantum of hundreds at a time. So, trying to bring some kind of energy and focus. I think, as I said, I think it is an industry, to whatever James kind of maps it as, in flux, because you've got lots of, almost every degree now. If you were doing, an MBA that's still teaching you a financial system that's in many ways been kind of discredited in the way that it's been structured, and you were doing an MBA in 2009-10 and learning about, a system that wasn't really working, you kind of question the value of it. Now, I'm a big geeky academic at heart, so I love that. But I think in property, there's a big chunk of it where you can make a lot of money doing essentially the same thing over and over again, but that there are systems, there are modes, there are processes and protocols, and they're fine, but they are under massive pressure to be revised at the moment because the world has changed and the way of doing things hasn't caught up with that. So I don't think it's a coincidence, Amy, that I started, with my consultancy, I worked a lot in the residential space, when residential investment in the UK historically was really people building their own private portfolios, trying to buy a couple of properties to rent out as a pension. And actually that institutional investment, so pension funds themselves buying, not, 5 or 10, buying thousands of properties that they would rent out at scale to a high standard. It kind of flipped the narrative so much that people who've been trained to do things in a certain way couldn't get their head around it. So not to get too technical, but the fundamentals of like resi valuation, for weird quirks, we value residential property differently, rely on the kind of the VPV, the vacant possession value of a property. And actually, so you're in a kind of sales context, you're trying to ride that. If you are a big institution buying a portfolio, it might be student, it might be what we call build to rent, or the kind of multi-family side of things, or it could be just a big chunk of houses. You're actually looking at the income. So you're thinking much more like a hotel operator or a shopping center operator. So, I don't care what the kind of the hard number is when it's empty, because I don't want it to ever be empty. I want it to ride this kind of the income that it generates me. So yes, coming into that room, being somebody who didn't have that training, but it meant I wasn't constrained by the kind of computer says no mentality of this is how we're trained, this is how it's done here. And you see that happen, the shift that's happening in terms of sustainability and ESG. Yes, there's a lot of political noise, particularly in the kind of right-wing parts of America that are trying to label it in the same sort of culture wars bucket. But actually, it has created a marked shift between a bit of token box ticking at the end of a bid to serious institutional investors saying, we will not accept anything in our portfolio that does not meet these carbon performance standards, that does not deliver some kind of social impact. And again, I was just kind of lucky that I'd worked in some of that stuff well before it was interesting or fashionable. But it meant that I kind of knew a bit, and then I was interested, so I went and I learned some more, and then I would ask the questions and bring that outside expertise into what are often very siloed, extremely professional, extremely expert, but quite siloed rooms of people who think that way.
How do you stay unconstrained? And maybe that's a sort of rhetorical question, but I am really interested in your view, because we've talked quite a lot, haven't we, James, about the importance of curiosity in leaders. So crucial to being able to continuously innovate is not becoming constrained by one way of thinking, one way of doing things. But it's very difficult to do when you're told to do things a certain way, just as you've described. What do you do to keep yourself kind of curious and interested and unconstrained from more maybe traditional ways of thinking about things?
I do more than one job at a time, which is what James is alluding to. So I think a little bit that I get bored very easily, but I do think to your point, it's that linear thing. So that expectation that you would do one job really hard, that was a day job, and then you'd retire, and then you'd maybe have a portfolio of a few non-exec things in your very later years, and that was that you'd share your experience. Well, actually, companies are realizing, A, that's not a hugely diverse pool of people, but also particularly with things like tech or ESG or, you know, diversity and EDI, actually people who are in work and a bit younger and having that experience bring a different perspective than very expert and really important, but people in their late 60s who have had a 40-year career in the city. So there is this kind of big shift. So I was really fortunate when I joined PfP, having run my own business. One of the things that was a requirement for me was that autonomy of over my time, and also that I knew I needed to do other things, because just doing one thing at a time is anathema to me. It's one of the reasons I left government. At the time, I couldn't cope with the idea that you'd sit on a bill team and you'd literally write the same piece of legislation over and over again for 2 years. I go nuts. I don't mind deep work and I don't mind like detail, but that one route was a nightmare. So when I run my own business, I'd been involved with some charities. I've been a trustee of some small charities. I then got asked to be on the trustee of another small business, you know, on the board as a non-exec. So I got that. So one of my negotiating points when I went back into being an employee full time was to say, I'm still going to do some of this outside stuff. Obviously, if there's a conflict, I'll flag it. And obviously, but I'll try and pick things that aren't a conflict. But also for me, the word is always, I encourage other people to do, it's cross-pollination, because your brain is sparked by different things. So I'm on the PLC board of a tech company in commercial real estate. So there's no conflict at all with my entirely resi day job. But the number of times that those meetings will spark things in my head that I would never have occurred to me are relevant. And it makes me better at my job. You know, I chair 2 charities, and those are kind of really, you know, any kind of charity thing is a big commitment of your time, but they add so much value to me as a person. But also it's amazing how often there are these touch points and intersections, because it's that kind of 7 degrees of separation thing. So the more that you do that, the more you're enhancing your personal interest in your network, but also the more you're, I think, bringing stuff to a career offer. So when I mentor people, and there is a gender aspect to this, but, you know, men are much more likely, you know, there's all that studies from HP of if there are 10 criteria for a job, a man will, you know, have 5 or 6 and be like, yeah, I'll give it a go. Why shouldn't I? As they should. And a woman will kind of go, oh, I've got 9, but I really should have 10 before I even apply. So women take themselves out of the process before that. It's not even positive discrimination. Like, what you need is the positive action to get women to feel confident enough to do that. That also applies in terms of leadership, where people get to a point of going, oh, I'd love to get a bit of non-exec, or I'd like to get more involved with something. But actually men have probably picked up some of those, and it's not always, but more commonly picked up something like that along the way in their 30s. And actually women who've tended to go, I must prioritize one thing at a time, and then I will have a family, but then I will come back and try and do it. Whereas my touchstone has always been say yes to the opportunity and then figure it out and ask for help, because there will always be somebody who can help you.
But asking for that help is not always good for everybody.
No, it's not always easy for everybody, is it?
It's hard to do.
It's always good for people. It's not always easy.
Oh no, that's a really interesting challenge.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry.
To be perceived as an expert sometimes, right? And if you feel like I'm here to be the expert, but I think the help doesn't necessarily need to be in that context. So again, if you've built these diverse, again, I'm being a bit geeky, but Mark Ventresca is like my favorite professor that I ever had when I did my master's at Oxford, and he's a sociologist. He also works in kind of innovation and strategy, and he has this whole theory about weak ties and strong ties. So you know that thing you could do on Twitter before it got ruined, that it would like map your network, and it give you these little nodes and these little radials. And his whole thesis is that actually the more dispersed those are, the benefits of the weak ties actually add up to they're just as valuable as the strong ones, like the direct day-to-day contacts, but just in those specific ways. Actually, the biggest asset I bring is I've got a phenomenally large, very odd, like massively dispersed network, but there will be somebody I can ask if I don't know the answer, and if it's not comfortable or appropriate for me to ask the people I'm directly working with, there will be somebody in that network I can ask. And actually, I think having that confidence to build that group, but also then to use that's probably the best advice I could.
I love that research.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, that's right on your.
It's not only that. I love that you brought up weak ties, because it's not only that weak ties versus strong ties are actually better predictor of career success. They're also one of the strongest predictor of our long-term well-being. In fact, people with more weak ties are less likely to die young, significantly less likely to die young than people with fewer weak ties.
Well, then you just seen that in COVID, didn't you, Amy? Because that whole thing of the people who relied on certain core pathways couldn't have that. Whereas if you had, and everyone again, it's this very cultural thing in Britain. People go, oh, I haven't seen him for ages, I couldn't possibly ring. Where, you know, like I've literally just had a girls' weekend in the Cotswolds. You can probably see my hangover, but like literally, it's a friend. I had a friend from Australia and a friend from the US. Both of whom managed to be in the UK at the same time, and we haven't seen each other for about 4 years. I don't speak to them regularly. I don't, you know, we're not good, like, but we managed to all coalesce and we had the best time for 48 hours. And if you take away that burden of requirement of, you know, what a good friend is or what a good colleague is, and that frequency of communication, actually, it's perfectly possible to be like, hey, we haven't spoken in ages, but I have this thing. You interested? Like, or do you want some help? And I think that's, again, where culturally Brits are really, really bad at that. But it's one of the things when, you know, you see networking in different cultural contexts and you realize that actually people who are confident to build those weak ties and not be embarrassed about it, and not be mercenary either. You want to be sincere, but it's enormously valuable. So
I if I may say, I think you've got a squiggly career and a squiggly network. I think that's probably the one way of looking at it all. But I think that weak tie bit is quite important, and understanding, and it's having the confidence to reach out to that network when you know you don't know. And it's something that I've really grown into actually over the years. So I'm now 45.
You're very good at it, James, because you do that. It's that artful. You make a specific request, but of a broad pool because you don't quite know who might have the answer.
Correct, but you know, but 10 years ago, Alex, I wouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
Because my maturity in terms of leading, my maturity in terms of managing, in particular, you know, having the confidence to say I don't know is something that I think it takes a long time for leaders to realize that you're not meant to know everything. The whole purpose of you being a great manager is to bring the people around you that do know. Yeah. And as a consequence, it's and this is something I can't even remember when I talked about it, but you got to realize that the sum of the parts is greater than the whole.
Yeah.
And I always expected that actually the whole is meant to be better than the parts. And this is why I made a point the other day about me being a bad manager, because I was terrible, because I assumed that I had to be this all-encompassing thing, and I think that speaks actually, by the way, of a lot of, and Amy, I know we probably don't want to go down this as a rabbit warren of thought, but when you come to innovative leaders, the best innovative leaders are the curious minds and the ones that are very open to everybody's mindsets and everybody's attitudes and everybody's experiences and everybody's knowledge to make them and the company a better place and more innovative.
But leadership has fashions as well, doesn't it? So like you know, I'm sure you guys listen to the kind of Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, kind of their leading podcast.
I don't, but I've heard it's going to be absolutely fantastic.
Well, the politics one is brilliant, but the one they've also added on, you know, because it might as well, but they've added one called Leading. So they interview leaders about their leadership style, but they just did one last week with Bill Gates. But there's this fascinating challenge that Rory Stewart makes, which I think is a really good one, that we are in this mode where a certain quite narrow type of very male, very you know, the tech bro that cultural leadership is becoming seen as the dominant expectation. So my CEO did a brilliant post recently where he was saying, I'm not a confident public speaker, I'm not good at it, but I'm a lot better than I thought I would be, and I was, because I do these things. But one of his points was, you know, we don't all need to walk around the stage. Steve Jobs did that brilliantly. And like that is, but actually, if you are, you know, that style doesn't work for everyone, and actually can be really distracting and quite annoying. So like it's having as you said, that building that confidence to do it differently. But I think we are in this mode where that kind of tech bro, cool, cash style of leadership is there. But there are also plenty of organizations and cultures, you know, like, and in a regulated environment where the buck does stop with the leaders. You know, we joke about it, but like my FD's frequent thing is like, you know, if we get this wrong, blah, blah, you know, you're in trouble, but I go to jail, because FCA are very much like handcuffs first and questions later. And so, or you're in an environment where you're protecting your staff, because if you're dealing, you know, with a friend of mine who's a firefighter, you know, the horrific stuff that they have to deal with well beyond fire, you know, big bit of being the leader of a team is that he has to protect and hold. But so he is struggling with exploring different ways he can lead that team that aren't in a command control way, because sometimes they need to be in a command and control in an instant. And so I think that fluidity is the thing to try and get. And for me, hopping across different contexts, so different organizations, different types of people, different networks of people. But it required me to realize that, so somebody really smart told me, you know, who gets to define you're an expert? So, you know, there's certain things we know. If you're a pilot, it's the number of flying hours. If you're a surgeon, it's, you know, the number of operations completed and the ratio of death to survival and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, for those of us working in that less material, more intangible space, or as my daughter says, just talking, then, you know, it's eventually confidence, feeling expert enough to chuck something in. But also, I think that expertise being able to be corrected or adapted because the environment has changed. It's not a static thing. But as soon as you allow yourself as a leader to think, no, I know that I'm good at this, I'm open and I'll learn, because we'd love to have that panacea of surrounding yourself with people who are brighter than you and the best minds and being able to bounce it off. But also the reality is teams don't always work like that. So one of the biggest lessons I had was that, with hindsight, my first 3 teams were really high performing with fantastic bosses who took professional development of all of us really seriously, who nurtured us, who put aside funding for us to go on training. Like, it was amazing. And then I got into like my 4th job and had a not so good boss and a not such a good team. And it was like being hit by a truck, because I was like, my God, this is not normal. But actually, if you've had that experience, then you know what it's like. Then you I know what I'm always trying to recreate.
Yeah. And that's, And I remember I've had a couple of really bad jobs actually when I was employed, and my wife would say to me, well, Joe, Amy, she would say, you learn more from the jobs that you're sort of badly managed than the ones that you are well managed.
Absolutely.
And it's so very true. I'm going to take you in a different direction, Alex, if I can, because I think, as I predicted, I sort of wrote out some basic questions and knew there was absolutely no way in hell that we would follow.
I can answer them really quickly, because I'm very conscious I haven't talked about the government body stuff.
Well, no, we'll come back to that, because I do want to pick up on a couple of other things in terms of, I've got a list of things I want to go through here. So number one, I want to pick up on something you said about our industry, and I often use the term that I think we have a branding problem. I think this is a wonderful place to be, but I think we genuinely brand ourselves wrong. We're not often looked at as being forward thinking. So I think actually we lose a lot of people early on. So that's more of a statement than a question. But a couple of things. So the way Amy and I are sort of looking at this as a book is there's definitely sort of 2 areas around sort of digital transformation on the top level. And there's so many frameworks out there. I think there's something like 16 frameworks with over 100 different attributes that make up all of those frameworks collectively. And we sort of gather them around, and looking at it now, no one really makes a distinction between what we are sort of calling practical steps and people steps in terms of the way that transformation is working. And we've talked so far a lot about the sort of the people element and the leadership and the team and all that sort of stuff. I want to go back to what we're looking at as drivers, and you mentioned it a little bit here about the drivers being ESG, and I know you sort of chair quite a few of the sort of ESG committees and everything here. Yeah. Can you just give me just a top level perspective on your feelings around ESG as a driver of change within our sector?
Ooh.
And where are we at the moment in that change? And that is a very broad topic, but deliberately so, because I'm just really interested in where that goes.
So there's that umbrella that I alluded to earlier, that for some there's still this proof of concept is lacking. So the idea that's intrinsic in a kind of white middle class, I do my recycling, I sort into however many things, and I drive a Tesla, so therefore I've got an electric car, so I'm doing my bit for the environment. But have you come up with the concept of the just transition? So it's this idea that's informing to a lot of policy that actually all the benefits of a shift to a more sustainable economy, us hitting whatever net zero targets our governments needs to happen without the poorest people and the poorest countries suffering even more. So there is that inherent thing that India and China and big chunks of Africa are having their industrial revolution and going, well, you had yours, sod off, we're not going to stop doing ours. But actually they will be the people most affected. And if we suddenly stop buying certain things, or we shift our production methodology or whatever in a certain way, then the knock-on effects, like you could argue that the closure in Port Talbot of the steel production that was announced last week, that is being driven for outwardly lots of sustainable as well as wider market issues, but actually it's going to have a huge effect on quite a poor community that really depends on that as an employment source. But also you can argue that electric cars aren't actually any better for the environment because of all the components that go into their batteries and the damage that's done sourcing them. So we don't have all the answers. It's not a linear journey. And so I think the biggest problem for ESG is that credibility gap. There is because the pace of change in terms of tech innovation, but then policy and regulatory adoption is such a gap between them. When you have that, you can try and push for first mover advantage, but then if something goes wrong or it doesn't go as well as it should have done, you see this in modern methods of construction as well, then actually you burn a lot of that credibility. So I worked on a very simple environmental project when I was a civil servant still, and they'd done a big retrofit and got some really whizzy building tech to kind of monitor the energy and the heating and the lighting and the cooling and everything. And they went back very excitedly to do an energy audit. They'd also done a huge engagement campaign. So they were trying to encourage people to take the stairs instead of the lift. You know, we're going to make sure this building reduces its energy, you know, and they had like a competition across the government department that it was. And unfortunately, I think they did the energy audit and they discovered that the building's energy use had doubled. And what had happened was, it wasn't the software per se, but it was quite complicated. The facilities manager who'd been trained on it had retired or got a new job after about 3-4 months. There was no budget to train his successor, who just went, I have no idea what that is. I'm just going to leave it. So opened the windows when they were hot and whacked up the heating when they were cold. And like, you know, it's the tech in itself was not the solution. But the most unfortunate consequence was there was a whole load of people who'd really engaged and really bought into that as an idea of like being more sustainable as an organization. Well, that was a waste of time. And I think we're seeing that, James, in the kind of the lag between things like CHP, so like combined heat and power, or district heat networks that were really pushed 10 years ago as a really, really sustainable solution. But CHP, I'm sorry, it's getting very techie building wise, but it's essentially burning the waste byproducts of building in order to generate more energy. And 10 years ago, the government was giving financial grants to developers to do that, because it was seen as, instead of just chucking it into landfill, you can put it in these like plants where you can burn it off, but you can actually generate more energy, and that's great. Whereas now you've got net zero investors going, hell no, we don't want to burn things. We want proper net zero generated energy. We're not funding anything with that. But the time lag for maybe a local authority that's invested in this and has only just got it operational, you know, so there's a real confidence gap in how serious is all of this, and like, is this the right one? Air source heat pumps is another one. Ground source heat pumps are really good, but only work in certain ground conditions, and they're very expensive and they're quite high maintenance. But air source heat pumps historically were a bit ropey, kind of on the efficiency side of things. If they went wrong, there'd be like 3 engineers in the country you could have to have them. And a friend of mine ran a portfolio of retirement homes, and she said, like, we had 3 go down at the same time, and you've got all these elderly people that we need to keep warm. Like, we can't risk it, so we're going back to gas. But actually now, you know, through investment and iteration and product innovation, as well as kind of ecosystem innovation, air source heat pumps are pretty reliable, and they're getting cheaper, and they're much smaller, they're much quieter. So I think they are something that's on the verge of being adoptable as a technology. But in that wider environment, you've got the smart meter thing, where lots of people are being forced to have smart meters who don't want them, they don't trust them. So a lot of this is about the trust that needs to go with the tech. And so to your question, I think the biggest problem is that time lag. So from an investment angle, where I sit, all the investors want everything to be as green as possible, as socially positive as possible, ideally for free. So there's real reticence about investing and paying, like putting an additional line in your P&L that invests in that over time, because that is what's required at a development level.
So let me just try and consolidate that down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in essence you're saying that ESG it holds an incredibly important position within the industry and within the sector, and it is a large driver of change. However, before any change is material and long-term and sustainable, there is a considerable trust gap that we currently have from the technology to the end consumer, whether that be business or general public,
or
as
both,
to whether they actually stick with it and agree with it.
No, so fair? For instance, in our context, you know, we are the portfolio owner on behalf of our investors of significant numbers of homes, but the people within those homes have a legal right, as they should, to choose their own energy supply. So we can't force them. So, you know, a lot of the committees that I'm on, James, are kind of reminding the people who set the regulation that if you own an office or a shopping centre, they're quite homogenous, and if you're the owner and the landlord, you can get all the data, you can kick him out, he's not complying, and it's fine. In housing, not that simple, and rightly people have protection, but it means that we can't, you know, people either don't want to give you the data, or they think you're kind of trying to put in a chip to monitor them, or they see it's a privacy issue, or, you know, or it's just harder to get, but also we don't have control. We can incentivize and encourage, but we can't mandate. There's nuances there that it's not the same for everybody across the piece. And I think
so. Hang on. So, and I think this is important.
Risk and compliance is just the other bit, that a lot of this ESG stuff is now being put into either regulation, financial regulation. So there's things like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, so TCFD. It's been adopted by about 200 jurisdictions, and it's you know, it's sensible. It's trying to tie your finances, your numbers, to the climate risk, but the unintended consequences, kind of, it's all becoming very, very process driven, very regulatory framework, very wordy, very risk based, and it is taking it another step further away from how do we make this a more sustainable
and
place.
if I may say, very E and very G in a sense, because the governance, and it's forgetting the S in the middle, which incidentally brings me up. This is brilliant. I could run a radio program. This is so smooth. To the another point you made earlier on about, don't laugh, Amy. Honestly, this is Alex is going to go off on one, and she needs to, because I need to run and go and get my power supply to power this this computer.
Okay.
But you talked about some of the challenging areas of society that perhaps aren't as lucky as others, and I used to call this way back in the day about the technology underclass.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, when we're talking about all of this wonderful technology, and this is in particular about the residential sector, that, you know, there is actually this was around, I did a large project for a housing association, and they were all looking, you know, we need to push this forward and push this forward and push this forward. And saying, hang on a second, what about the people who don't want to, either can't afford to push it forward or can't push it forward? And we called them the technological underclass. So I'm going to set you off on a question there, which was, obviously we're looking forward to a digital transformation journey within the real estate sector. What happens to the people that either can't afford to, or don't want to, or can't transform? And I'm going to run, and I'm going to assume I know what the answer is, but I'll be back in about 25 seconds.
Okay. Well, so I think the point is, the other bit that I'd written down on my notepad is the word capacity. So, you know, not only is there that time lag between sort of tech evolution and adoption, and there's got to be the capacity to take it on board. So a bit like that example I gave with the facilities manager who got replaced, there wasn't the budget to like train somebody twice. So it wasn't a failure of the tech, and it wasn't a failure of the project, but it was just the capacity in the project didn't support that ongoing iteration that was needed. So we had, you know, through COVID, like lots of RPs, you know, that digital divide was really, really clear. So we had a lot of, you know, people trying to do homeschool. It's not just about getting people devices. You know, you can donate laptops and stuff left, right, and center, but actually trying to point out that we'd have customers who might have 4 children in a socially rented tenancy, and they had a pay-as-you-go SIM card. So they didn't have enough Wi-Fi for their children to all be doing, you know, they had one device that they could power at a time. They didn't have enough data allowance for their children to be uploading all their homework. They didn't have the capacity in that sense. So that capacity one is really, really key there. And then organizational capacity. So one of the hats I wear is I'm a government advisor around the digital planning program. So there's all this amazing innovation about speeding up our kind of planning framework, and that's great. But then, you know, there is the fundamental, just like the NHS still uses fax machines, right? You know, that's a structural failing in there. Big chunks of the local authority planning department are not kitted up with the software to take stuff back. So they're sending stuff off to these central kind of government funded bodies to do all this kind of whizzy stuff, but then they can't take the format of the documents back again because they're still running, I don't know, Windows 5 or something, that they literally, there is no way for them to access it. And that will quite, you know, at a time when local authority budgets are so tight and so constrained. So again, it's capacity in all those models for people to actually engage and adopt in more than a tokenistic way. And I think that's where the negative around greenwash and then impact washing. So to your point, it's like, oh yeah, it's great, we donated loads of laptops. And one of the charities that I'm involved with is about kind of electric e-waste, because actually what happens to all the laptops that we think we're so generously donating to Africa is they all end up in landfill with a small child soldering all the precious metals out of them. They're not actually usable in most of those markets. So we fund solar powered IT labs that allow children to have IT education that will give them skills for the future. Because there was a teacher that we had we met this guy in Ghana, and he was literally teaching IT with a picture on cardboard of a computer and going, you press enter, then you type this and then do that. And that's how he was teaching a class of 16-year-olds. Because they'd been donated shed loads of crappy old kit, but it wasn't usable for them. So that capacity to have the right thing at the right time. And as he says, the community engagement piece that needs to happen for people who are either nervous, they're frightened, they don't have the skills. So there can be some really important stuff about just kind of helping people get familiar with stuff. But there's also people who just don't want to engage with it, or they have data concerns or privacy concerns and they're nervous. And, that there is a real risk that we take away all those services. So a bit like the current kind of thing around parking payments. There's like so many different apps and they're going to finally be forced to consolidate a bit. But actually, if you don't own a smartphone and you're used to going to a certain place and paying with a coin, it's really intimidating to have this shift and not be able to access it.
So how do we, as an industry, and I'm sorry, I mean, this is the last of my points on this stuff. How do we as an industry look after the technological underclass when it comes to a transformation journey? And this is probably specifically with a resi focus, because obviously I know that's your background. How do we do that?
Greenwashing and impact washing, is it? So there's a really good article from Gemma Bourne that I cite all the time, but she is at PfP Capital, and she wrote it last year about impact washing in social housing, and particularly basically saying that the two things. So when I teach a course around impact investing in housing, and I teach at Oxford, the things I say is it's about additionality and intentionality. So intentionality, you have to be meaning to do it. It can't just be an accidental byproduct of, oh look, we happen to build this like development and there was a skate park next door to it, so woohoo, that'll be great. Like that, you have to have an intention to focus on that impact. So to focus, James, on the technological underclass or the the digitally kind of poor people that are there. And then the additionality, it has to be over and above your core element. So if you're a social housing provider and you deliver the social housing you're committed to delivering, that's not impact. That's you doing your job. You can't give yourself 5 stars for that. That's what you should be doing. The additionality is about what over and above on that are you able to deliver for that community? Is it you notice that there's a food bank and it needs more support? Is it that you can bring in additional coaching or mentoring, or you can bring in some evening classes, or you can engage the community in a way that responds to them? And this is kind of the thesis of all the wider placemaking stuff when you get into this argument about regeneration and gentrification. So regeneration, if it's done properly, is really locally led. It's responding to people's needs, people who already live there, as well as the people you're trying to bring in. Gentrification is like, oh, this place would be so much nicer if we got rid of those horrible bakeries and put in like a Gales. That'll be really nice. And then kind of, it's nice for a segment of population, but not for the whole. And sometimes there are tensions in that. But I think the impact that, as you would expect, lots of consultancies, you alluded to the kind of range of tech frameworks, right? But we know the BPF research we did a couple of years ago, there's more than 500 certifications and benchmarks across real estate for ES&G. And as you said, they started with the E ones because they were, carbon you can measure and it's tangible, and there's lots of different frameworks. The S ones are the ones in the spotlight at the moment. So every good consultancy is launching their own version. And fine, and I get it. As investors want a number, a material number to put, we have delivered X amount. I think a lot of the methodologies are questionable. I struggle to see how you can say that you've delivered 5,000 something lessons, so that means a material number of impact, or that, we've built this, so therefore we've created that. And actually, it can create more problems if you put on your hoarding, this project has delivered £30 million of social value. Probably rightly, a lot of local people are going to be like, well, where is it then? I haven't seen that. Where's my money? Like, give it to me. I'm here. So actually, I think one of the interesting things over the next few years will be a much more rigorous assessment of what really counts as impact, what really counts as social value in a real estate context. And I think, to your point, James, actually a lot of it might well be around that tech space, because that is something that can be measured and actually addressed. Whereas, the more complex social issues, well-intentioned kind of donations, whether it's to tech or to homeless charities, don't always help. You need that frontline expertise and that long-term connection.
I think what I'm hearing from everything that you've been talking about is that underlying all of this, underlying good innovations, good sustainable innovations, is really getting to the heart of what people want, what they need, and will therefore adopt. How do you do that? So how do you go about understanding what it is that the people who are going to be impacted by this stuff, what they want, what they need?
So it's genuine engagement. The industry has a bad reputation for kind of, oh yes, we did a consultation, and it's either something that's sent out on like a Christmas Eve with a 2-week deadline, or it's one Wednesday night with some post-its and and those kind of events that have value. Don't get me wrong, but innately they engage a certain demographic who are people who are already probably quite engaged already, have the time. So you'll get a disproportionate level of retired people who've got can spend their time on it. And actually, there's lots of hard to reach communities that you can't get to. So in a pure project basis, one of the things that I love is that our development management company, Igloo, they're really good at, they'll hire like a community organizer, which is kind of an American term, but someone who literally will go and live in a community and engage with people for 18 months before we put in a planning application, but really get to know people and understand that. And that, obviously create additional costs, but it means that the planning application responds to what those people really need and want, not just to our vision of what we think we can do to them. And actually, therefore, you get more support and more buy-in and more engagement. So, genuine community engagement, not just a tick box thing, that, and there were all sorts of great tech startups, Built ID were an early one, Commonplace, FutureFox. There's lots of tech platforms that are supporting that as well, so they can capture the more digitally engaged people. I think most local authorities actually are very, very good at recognizing, like I live in Bristol, we have a very large Somali population. They will hire community workers who speak Somali and can go door knocking, because certain, particularly women in those communities, won't come to fore or won't feel confident in certain scenarios. In our leisure centre business at PfP, we've done a huge amount on being cognizant of being inclusive, so having kind of gender inclusive toilets and doing all that kind of stuff, but also running exercise sessions for women only who don't feel comfortable, or in a religious context or whatever, in other scenarios. So it's about being able to be responsive to those, but that all takes time and investment, and it's nuanced, and it's not something you can just cookie cutter across and go like done. So that's why I think the S is the hardest one, James, that and is left to last. The other bit that I don't think we're honest about in the sector is...
Can I just pass comment on one thing on that? Yeah. Which is, I think this is what society, it's not the industry, I think society is struggling with most, which is, I would put it to you that in the past, it's been very binary.
Yeah.
Everything has been very binary in any which way we're looking at. And I think what we're getting to, and by the way, that is from things like there is the workplace and there is the home place.
Yes.
And gradually we've been sort of slightly blurring, and then obviously it's now massively expedited all the way through to real society, difficult aspects of male, female, and everything in between. So there's a massive societal and almost neurolinguistical challenge that we're faced with at the moment. And that is actually where the S is having a problem, because nothing is black and white anymore. And everything from leaders to industrial change are struggling with what does that mean, because there's no rule.
Can I give you a really simple example that literally I just had a meeting about this morning? So one of the standard metrics for social value is the number of apprentices employed on a project. Okay. It gives you a tick, because the assumption is that if someone is on an apprenticeship, they are more likely to be from a lower socioeconomic background.
Actually, interesting.
That's point that I was flagging was that, right now, lots of people who are choosing not to go into university and take on loads of debt, apprenticeships are much better funded, a much broader range of subjects than they ever used to be. Actually, there are plenty of very savvy, middle-class, well-funded, well-educated people who are choosing the apprenticeship route, which is great, because I think we're taking away that stigma, that kind of class snobbery about apprenticeships. However, are they therefore going to be a valid recognition of our impact? I'm not sure they are, because if we're getting apprenticeships from a broader pool, that's great. But if that breadth means that actually it's not a pool that was kind of addressing socioeconomic need in an area, it might not be as good a measure anymore. So it's hypothetical, but it is something we have to get our head around. At what point do we call that? And do we want to, if we've got young, engaged, bright people, wherever they come from, people don't necessarily want to be labeled. So that's where a lot of this is a real challenge. People want to be taken on their talent. And whether that's from a gender lens or a class or a ethnicity or any other background, but the well-intentioned elements of some of the S interventions can actually be very paternalistic or actually quite narrow. So you've got to be really, and the bit I wanted to just flag, James, because I think this is really important, is a scale thing. So Amy, your last question, how you do it, I think you have to do, our industry likes product innovation. It likes the widget, the thing, the specific, this will save you X amount of money. And actually that's shit because of the time frame horizon thing that I mentioned, that there's always that time lag, and we're so focused on perfecting this that we forget that the entire system has changed. So that could be fire eggs, or it's ESG, or whatever, some big scandal or some drama happens and everything's obsolete and can't happen anymore. If we could think more on the systems thinking basis, the ecosystem, which is actually what our industry is, it's an ecosystem of different professions and types, that would be great. The biggest challenge, I think, with the ESG bit that we're not honest about and should be, is that it is possible for me as a developer and investor with pension funds behind me. All of our funds are 25 or 30-year life funds. And all of our investors want impact because they see the value of it. But they are patient capital. They are in it for the long term. So we know we can invest in placemaking. We can invest in community engagement. We can invest in all that time-consuming granular stuff, because there will be a payback for us. We will deliver a market positive return and we'll deliver a better place. If, however, you are the 60-70% of the industry that is maybe funded by private equity, maybe it's your own money, but you're on a shorter IRR, an investment rate of return, your investment horizon is 3 years, 5 years, you can't take the same decisions. You are not going to get the payback, because all of this, like the long-term stuff of place-based investment, requires that patient capital. And I don't think we're being honest about the fact that it's not to give smaller developers an opt-out and be like, oh, we don't have to do any of this, but actually we need to make the tech quicker and more adaptable and cheaper for those people to be able to use it too. But we also need to recognize that the systems don't work. So a small developer next to a large one will just have resource constraints. I mean, they can't do that stuff, but they should. Why can't we blend across those boundaries and make it work better for the whole?
But there is also another issue there as well, though, Alex, which is there is a brand associated with making investments. And this is in particular with tech, which is we want a 10x return in 10 years.
Yeah, exactly.
And some of the stuff that we're battling with at the moment on a societal planetary level are not a 10x return in 10 years. They are
your total addressable market. It is not going to be a metric that works if you're genuinely talking about a mixed community and supporting affordable housing
across the entire world, which is the biggest issue. I am going to have to make a massive apology in the sense that my diary is no longer my own, and I get people booking things in which I have no control of anymore. Well, until I manage to get control of it back again, then it'll be fine. So I'm going to have to apologize and say I'm going to have to cut this short. I'm really sorry, Amy, if there's other questions here, but Alex, I'm sure. And by the way, I love listening to you because you take me to a different area of thinking. And it's a pleasure. I must hear you speak more. I must get some more panels and get you on because I think you're fantastic in terms of
it's really inspiring and really fascinating. Thank you, Alex.
No, thank you. Well, it would be good if you want to. I'm conscious we didn't get onto the kind of geospatial commission and the open data stuff.
That'd be really good.
You know, if you want to have a separate chat on that, and I promise I'll be more focused. But like that is because that is about bringing an innovation lens to policy, but also around engaging the private sector and trying to get it to work. But
well,
that
is
the head banging around all the people doing the same thing and duplicating and not collaborating is not helpful.
Yeah, well, that for me is where the talk about silos is so present actually, but also I think again that binary nature of well, this is public and that is private is no longer where it needs to be. Yes, we are making great strides in private partnerships private public partnerships, but I don't think we're anywhere close to where it needs to be.
The civil servants I work with, they still have a habit of saying the private sector as if it's a homogenous bubble.
Like entirely different.
And what do you mean by that? And if you talk to people about, you talk to people about a property and the stakeholders, I'm like, well, landowner and investor and developer are not the same. They could be three different people with three very different metrics. And that's before you get into architects and planners and everybody. So it's that real nuance. It's a complicated space, but it's interesting.
Well, and also, I mean, you're talking here about the UK. I mean, you think about the challenges that private, public and other organizational structure has in different areas of the world. It's entirely different.
I'm going to Australia next month to talk about, and Australia is a fascinating concept, right? It's a legal system built on ours, but with a much more entrepreneurial culture like in America, but they have no federal housing policy. No. And so it's entirely hodgepodge as to like what happens where. And so for things like tech, they can't even mandate the baseline tech stuff because there's no regulation for that because no one thought to do that when they founded the country. So, yeah.
We could go down. We could spend hours on it. And Amy, I'm sorry for this is your sort of interview. I'm telling you with Alex, and you two should definitely meet up and have a chat. There's a load of stuff in there. But publicly, Alex, just thanks ever so much for all of your